Thanks for visiting Common Fence Music. Tonight's performer is Ethan Leinwand, a talented young pianist who will guide us through early 20th century styles, including barrel house, blues, and stride piano. Thank you.
Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining me this evening. My name is Ethan Leinwand. I'm a barrel house blues pianist, and I want to thank Common Fence Music for helping host this event and bringing my living room to your living room. I'm here in St. Louis, Missouri, and one of the homes of this style of music. So today I prepared a set for you that really hopefully will explain this sort of obscure music that is barrel house blues. Not a lot of people know what this is or are very familiar with it. Even, old music aficionados don't really know a lot about this music. So I'm excited to show a little bit of it to you and share my love of this. So the first thing I want to do is kind of get you in the mood of what this kind of music is, what it sounds like. And I think a cool song to start with is one called The 31 Blues. And this is a song by Bob Call, and this was his only solo recording as a side of a 78 in 1929, and it's a train imitation kind of song, so it's got that kind of energy. So here is the 31 Blues to put you in the mood. That's the 31 Blues by Bob Call. A really cool little interesting barrel house instrumental tune. So what is barrel house blues? Okay, well, barrel house blues is it's a style of piano that was around in the early 20s through the 30s. And it's a music that sort of comes out of ragtime traditions meeting folk blues traditions in the Deep South. And it's this really important style of music, and it's forgotten, but just because it's forgotten doesn't mean it wasn't important. And so it was really this vital connection that connects ragtime through to boogie woogie, which would come afterwards. And boogie woogie is the rhythm behind rock and roll. It's one of the main roots of rock and roll. It's the piano sound of it. So it's a really cool it's a really cool and important part of American music, and the role of the piano in rock and roll and in American music has sort of taken a sideline to the guitar in those ways. But these guys in the early 20s were making rhythms and music that Jerry Lee Lewis would be trying to do, 30 plus years later in the mid 50s. So you have these like amazing young African Americans doing some awesome music, and that's something I really love about it. Now, I just threw out terms like ragtime and boogie woogie and all that. I'm throwing out all these words, and I know these terms might not mean a lot to you. So hopefully, over the course of this concert, you'll start to understand what those things are a little bit. Let's start with ragtime. So ragtime is the roots of American music. The syncopation of it. It goes back to the 1890s. People were doing this, and it was really the first great American music. And the first great composer of this music was Scott Joplin. And Scott Joplin wrote the Maple Leaf Rag in 1899, and it went on to be a huge hit, a very important piece of music. And we're going to hear some elements of ragtime. You're going to hear a strided bass, which is a chord, bass chord, oompa type rhythm, which is a big part of ragtime, and it's going to be a multi-strain piece, so it's going to have these different parts. And so here is the Maple Leaf Rag. So that's the Maple Leaf Rag, Scott Joplin's Maple Leaf Rag. A multi-strain piece, different parts, got the key changes, really sort of has some classical theory behind it, and all that great syncopation. So that music is going along in the aughts and the teens, And that ragtime becomes a craze, and it sort of seeps its way into all popular music, and a lot of that is disseminated through sheet music in that time. But what starts to happen in a time and we don't quite know is that a folk blues style, a song style, starts to emerge, and in the South. And so I want to play you an example of a folk blues melody, and this is one that comes from a piano player named Cooney Vaughn. And Cooney Vaughn is remembered as being the best piano player in Mississippi in the 20s and the teens. And there's a young piano player named Little Brother Montgomery. And he remembers hearing him as a little kid. His father owned a honky-tonk, Little Brother's father. And so he would hear these piano players as they came through town. This is in Louisiana, in Kentwood, Louisiana. So here's a tune that Little Brother remembers hearing by Cooney Vaughn. It's called the Tremblin' Blues, one of my favorite tunes of all time. All right, that's the Tremblin' Blues, as played by Little Brother Montgomery, but originally from Cooney Vaughn. And you can see in that tune there's a strided bass happening, sort of still in that very much in that ragtime tradition, but there's a swing element. The rhythm has a swing, which is one of the main elements of barrel house blues and blues music, and has that swing and that sort of blues language. And so what happens is, in the 1914, St. Louis Blues comes out. W.C. Handy publishes the St. Louis Blues, which is a piece of sheet music in song form, and the chorus is a blues. It's a 12-bar blues progression, and it sort of becomes this really popular thing. It sets off this craze. The first blues craze was from way back then, and you have this great folk tradition that then gets picked up by popular music. W.C. Handy is just sort of collecting these Southern folk songs, these blues, and publishing them, and they're becoming this popular music. So all these young kids then, if you were a young kid in 1918, 1919, you were born in, let's say you were born in 1906, right? Then in 1920, you're this 14-year-old kid, and the blues is your youth music. It's everything to you. You have these kids 5, maybe 6 years older than you. They can play it. It's the coolest thing to do. So you've taken this great folk blues tradition, and then once it becomes popular, it comes back down to the Deep South. And in the hands of these young kids, they take this blues and they create barrel house blues. They create all this music that is the roots of rock and roll and boogie woogie. And it's these young, passionate kids finding these really sweet pianistic ways of playing the piano. So let's get right into it. Let's play a tune that is barrel house blues epitomized. This comes from 1925. It's by a fellow named Herschel Thomas. Herschel Thomas was born in 1906. So in 1925, he's 19 years old. His older brother by about 20 years, was a music publisher named George Thomas. And they're from the Houston area, but they had moved to New Orleans in the early 20s or the late teens. By 1923, Herschel Thomas and George Thomas are up in Chicago. Everyone's up in Chicago by 1923. And so he's picked up all these moves from Texas, from the Deep South and Louisiana, from Chicago. And here's this young kid who tragically will die the next year. In 1926, he dies, but he leaves his mark up in Chicago and all over. And so this tune, the Suitcase Blues, is quintessential barrel house blues. It's got different left-hand elements, and we'll look into them a little bit afterwards. But anyway, here is the Suitcase Blues. So that's the Suitcase Blues. That's Herschel Thomas's Suitcase Blues. Here's this 19-year-old hotshot kid, a virtuoso piano player, showing off everything he picked up in his suitcase across his short life, doing things like, well, these big stride chords here, but then he gets into that sort of a boogie woogie rhythm that we're going to get into, and we'll talk a little bit more what makes that. And he's got these strides, and he's got these rolls. This is a cool, very important part of the Deep South piano blues tradition. And these fast single note chords, you know, if you think about like, well, what's like the crudest way to be good at the piano? Like, that's it right there, you know. You just hit those single notes as fast as you can, so it's this beautiful thing. And so he comes in there, and he blows it out the water. He has a really big impact. But like I said, he dies the next year. So what I want to do now is I'm going to jump forward a decade to 1936. And in 1936, we have Little Brother Montgomery. Little Brother Montgomery was born also in 1906, like Herschel Thomas. He was around in the Deep South in the Louisiana, Mississippi area. But again, in this time you have to understand, everything was connected by train. And it was easy to get around. And these guys could get around. And they could be up in Chicago in one day and be back into like the most rough and ready barrel house, you know, in Mississippi as they could find, you know, the next day. So they were all around. They were all traveling. It was this beautiful thing. So Little Brother Montgomery and Herschel Thomas, they meet each other in the early 20s. You know, these two young kids showing off their moves. And then, so we're going to fast forward now. Like I said, 1936, when Little Brother gets into the studio. So he got in there in 1930, but the Depression really dried up recording for these guys. So when he gets the opportunity, he's ready to go. And this is another quintessential sort of barrel house piece. The left hand keeps changing, different rhythms, all these other things. So I'm going to play for you now his masterpiece called The Fair Street Jive. And here is that piece. that's the Ferris Street Jive. Such a cool tune. And see, I say the main big difference of what's happened in that time is that boogie woogie has sort of entered into this language a lot more. If we heard the Suitcase Blues, there was more strided action, and this one started to start to move a little more on those left hands and get those rhythms. And those rhythms, and that's what boogie woogie is. So really, Chicago is what we associate with boogie woogie because guys like Herschel Thomas came up and other fellas from Alabama. Everyone was coming up there, and they were starting to do this style of music more. Now, boogie woogie, I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time describing the whole history of boogie woogie. I could do a whole show on that. It would be fun, but I'm really trying to focus a little more on the Barrel House. But you can't talk about Barrel House without boogie woogie because it was such a main component of it. So the sort of ubiquitous sound of boogie woogie gets popular in the late 30s, early 40s. There was a concert at Carnegie Hall called From Spirituals to Swing, and that really set off the craze. And sort of the rhythms that were going on, this is sort of boogie woogie rhythm as it came there. And you can hear that. There's rock and roll right there. A whole lot of shit going on, you know. So you can hear right in there is all those roots. So I want to do one or two demonstrations of sort of boogie woogie songs. And my favorite piano player in that style has to be Jimmy Yancey, the great Jimmy Yancey. Here he is pictured here in 1949. It's my own personal picture of him. I'm very proud to have it. So Jimmy Yancey, a little bit older than Herschel and little brother, not much, but maybe 5-6 years older. And he had his own touch, a really cool touch. He was a groundskeeper for the White Sox his whole life. But in the early 20s, at the parties, he was well in demand at the parties and the house rent parties in Chicago. And so I'm going to do a tune by him that kind of shows that boogie woogie style. This is Yancey's Bugle Call. So Jimmy Yancey was inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in 1986, first class as an influencer, partly because of how much he influenced those boogie woogie guys who really made it popular. And again, I could do a whole a whole concert just on Jimmy Yancey. I love him and his style. It's really varied, and it almost hurts me to not play another one of his to show you how much he has colors, the different colors and palette, different color palette and rhythm he gets. So I recommend really checking out Jimmy Yancey and some of his recordings. It's really cool piano music. But I want to talk a little bit more about boogie woogie. And another element of this boogie woogie style is the walking bass. Now, the walking bass is that's the kind of walking bass sound. It was one of the early versions of boogie woogie, of ragtime, turning into that instead of that 1, 2, 3, 4, it's 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 1 and 2 and 3. So you're getting all those little rhythms and that's it. So in order to play a boogie woogie song, I'm going to play one of my favorites, totally obscure tune, not part of the the grand story, but an awesome tune by a fella named Romeo Nelson. He only made 4 recordings with Romeo Nelson in 1929, but they were awesome. And this one, the Head Rag Hop, is really just sums up that walking bass, that party atmosphere in Chicago in those long ago days. So here's the Head Rag Hop. All right. 1929. Now, if that isn't rock and roll, I don't know what is. So that's so you have this awesome, really raucous, rhythmic, powerful rhythmic music, and that rhythm is usually generated or almost always generated through the left hand. And that was really what the contribution of these barrel house players was this very pianistic ideas of rhythm and things you can really only do on the piano. That's what I mean by pianistic. It's built for the piano, and it's one of the reasons I really love this music, because it's complete music for the piano in the same way that a Chopin nocturne is, or whatever have you. It's all right there for you. And in these days of confinement and sheltering in place, it's nice to have a buddy like the piano to keep you company. So, all right. So I kind of given you a nice little overview of barrel house blues, but really one of the things I really love about it are the different regional styles. And in each region, sort of different things developed and different ideas happened, and these young kids would be sharing it with each other. I mean, this was like the way of being cool, you know. And in the Deep South, these 16-year-old kids, they developed the 44 blues, and that was their tune. And the 44 blues, later on recorded by Roosevelt Sykes, who's the first guy to record it, and then Howlin' Wolf, Eric Clapton. A lot of people have played this tune, but its roots go back to the early 20s in the Vicksburg, Mississippi area. And if you didn't know how to play this tune, well, you weren't part of the the cool kid crew. You know, these are these young, 16-year-old kids. I mean, in this kind of times, the way to talk about this, I mean, these were the same kids, honestly, that are getting killed today. You know, the same ones then, the ones that you're getting arrested, the same ones that are playing hip hop, and people will say, well, "Why don't you just play? Wish you played that old music." But here, this is sort of like this was the same thing. This was their youth music. And the 44s was a local train, so this was like a hyper-local type tune. But anyway, here is the 44 Blues. Little Brother played a great big role in this, and I could do a whole lecture on just the 44 Blues. That's how passionate I am about this tune. So I'm going to zip my mouth and play one of my favorite tunes of all time, the 44 Blues, or as Little Brother called it, the Vicksburg Blues. All right, that's the 44 Blues, the Vicksburg Blues. That Little Brother Montgomery and a whole crew sort of developed it all together. And we see that same thing we heard in Suitcase Blues earlier, those great rolls. And I think personally, Herschel Thomas picked them up from that crew. Who knows? Could be the other way around. But everything was spreading, So even when we talk about these regional styles, it's important to know that everyone could hear everyone and can travel and kind of pick up on this stuff. In East Texas, in the Houston and Galveston area, there was a great crew. They were known as the Santa Fe Group because that's the train they rode to get from these gigs to gigs, these barrel houses in sawmill camps and turpentine camps and oil fields. These are these work camps where they were secluded. So on the weekends or in the nights when they wanted to have the entertainment, they would convert the barn into a bar. They'd serve whiskey right out the barrel. And they'd have an itinerant piano player would come through. If not, whoever could pick out the piano would sit down and play what they could until they were lucky enough to have one of these hotshot dudes come in. These guys were like Black Boy Shine, Nine Finger Charlie, Peg Leg Will, all these colorful characters, and they played this great style of Texas barrel house that had a lot of ragtime elements in it. And the song you had to play if you wanted a gig there was called The Cows. And so I'm going to do a version of The Cows, kind of a mashup version of how different guys used to play it. So here is The Cows. All right, so that's a little bit of The Cows, sort of Texas style. And what I hope you can hear in that is that it's got a lot of ragtime influences. It's got this sort of deep stride element. These kind of syncopated walk down when hearing six that it moves down in. That's a big part of what you hear in ragtime music. And so that's something I want you to just be aware of. All these styles were mixed in cool ways. St. Louis had a style all of its own. That's where I am. It's why I moved here, was connecting to this beautiful style of barrel house blues that we call the low-down blues. In St. Louis, they weren't striding, they weren't as much boogie-woogieing. They had this great accompaniment style that was plaintive, that involved just sort of getting low with it. And I'm going to do a song by the great Henry Brown. I'm going to do a version of his style of playing. It was hard to choose, again, hard to choose just one player to do, but here's Henry Brown style piano blues. It's low down and yet it lifts you up. It's got this beautiful, lovely thing. right, so that's the Henry Brown style. That's that St. Louis sound, a plaintive, low down kind of thing. It was. I keep avoiding trying to go on these tangents. I right now want to go on a whole tangent about the roots of popular blues and the role of piano in this music, because it's kind of all gotten forgotten how important the piano was in this early blues. We've become so obsessed with the folk guitar blues tradition of Robert Johnson and the Delta that we've lost the contributions of cities like St. Louis and the piano, guys like Petey Wheatstraw, the Devil's Son-in-Law, and Roosevelt Sykes and Henry Brown. But save that for another concert. I hope you've enjoyed this show and hope you learned a little something and enjoyed some really just fun piano music built for this kind of piano. So I'm very lucky to have this old Jay Bauer here. I'm going to end with one more song. This song, I think, gives an idea of the lasting importance of Barrel House Blues. This is called the Cow Cow Blues. Cow Cow Blues was written by Cow Cow Davenport, a great early barrel house piano player out of the vaudeville circuit from Alabama, settled where else but Chicago in the mid-20s. And this song, the Cow Cow Blues, became greatly important. How important? Well, it's the mess around. Ray Charles' mess around is the same tune from, again, we're talking about 30 years later, and they're still just doing the same thing. There's last tangent I'm going to go on. There's a great Texas barrel house piano player in the 60s, and they were asking him, what they thought of Ray Charles and Jerry Lee Lewis and that stuff, and he said, well, that's nothing new. That's nothing we weren't doing, and it's true. In the 20s and 30s, they were all doing this stuff. It was all there. It's really cool, and they just wanted the blues, and they wanted them low, and so that's what they gave them. So my last song for you guys is the Cow Cow Blues from 1929 till today. So, here it is. tuning in, and I hope you've enjoyed this concert and learned a little something about Barrel House Blues. Again, my name is Ethan Leinwand from St. Louis, Missouri. I want to thank Common Fence Music for hosting me, and I hope to play for you all in person someday. And if you have any questions about this kind of music, you can find my website and email me, and I'd be happy to answer any questions you have about it. Again, thank you all so much.
Good afternoon, friends of folk music. My name is Tom Perotti. I'm the Education and Community Outreach Director for Common Fence Music, and I'm here today talking to the very talented Ethan Leinwand, the St. Louis-style barrel house piano player and preservationist. It's a beautiful day in Middletown here, Ethan. What's the weather like?
It's a hot day here in St. Louis. The heat has arrived, and it's not going anywhere.
Well, I want to start with a little bit about your early days. You're from Middletown, Connecticut. What can you tell me about?
Well, I grew up in Middletown, Connecticut, and I started taking piano lessons as a young kid. People always want to ask you, when you started playing piano. It's a question they love to ask. I started when I was 8, and I took sort of normal piano lessons, normal kid piano lessons till I was about 13, and then I quit, kind of like everybody else. But I wasn't quitting music. I had already sort of developed a personal relationship with the piano. I was really interested in writing music. I wanted to be a film composer for forever. That was sort of my dream. And so I'd write all this sort of cinematic type music on the piano and
Interesting.
learn about it, I guess. So that kind of kept me going forward for a long time.
Did you have a particular teacher early on that inspired you?
Well, I had one piano teacher. Her name was Mrs. Fredericks, and she let me kind of learn what I wanted to learn. And if I came in that week and I just made up my own song, she loved that too. She would bring me some classical stuff and some sort of contemporary young adult jazz music that people were writing. So she had a wide range, and she, whatever it was, she would let me try to learn it. So I really appreciated that.
Now, you told me you have a general interest in history, and what did that have to do with your journey?
Well, when I went to college, I quickly came into crisis as a piano player, like those kind of places, those schools, and you meet these young kids who seem to got it all figured out. And there was a simplicity to my music. There always was a lyricism that I felt very overwhelmed. I went to Wesleyan University in Connecticut, and they have a strong, avant-garde jazz tradition and experimental music and all the stuff that I didn't really relate to, only enough to make it hurt my feelings like I was doing something wrong. But I discovered there a love of music history, classical music history, actually, at college. And it was just something about the ways in which it kept changing, the ways in which you didn't have classical music until you had, this Mozart and Beethoven to remember, and then how everyone reacted against that and said, this is the thing. And that keeps the way it keeps changing and stuff. So that love of history and reading about it and thinking critically about it is really what got me going on the barrel house when I first discovered New Orleans rhythm and blues, and then boogie woogie, and then what came before that, and really just trying to understand that journey.
And so I've got a list of your favorite performing artists here: Little Brother Montgomery, Black Bob, Jimmy Yancey, Henry Brown, Petey Wheatstraw, Aaron Pinetop Sparks, Albert Ammons, I've heard his name, Robert Shaw, Cooney Vaughn, Professor Longhair, I've heard of him, and Carl Sonny Leyland. At what point were you really digging into the works of these particular artists?
Well, it's an ongoing process. So when I was 25, I had lived in New Orleans for a brief time and taught music there, but I had moved up to Brooklyn, where my brother was, and most of my friends and my support network was. And I got into boogie woogie first. And so I was mostly watching YouTube videos and seeing people's fingers and being like, that's the sound I was looking for. That's that complete statement. I think I talked about that in the concert. And so it started with Boogie Woogie, and my first real love was Jimmy Yancey, the great Chicago poet. So the process has been slow. At that point, I probably would, if I had listened to Little Brother Montgomery, I wouldn't have liked it. There's some of the stride elements, some of those more, I guess, jazz and ragtime feelings. I was really trying to avoid that. So it's kind of like as I began to explore more in the piano and wanted to get a different set of skill sets, say a stride set or these different things, that's when I would discover the next guy, and they would take me on through the next period. So right now I'm pretty deep in the Texas guys like Robert Shaw. I've been listening a lot to, and always Little Brother Montgomery. Those guys.
And so where did you head after Brooklyn?
After Brooklyn, I was in Brooklyn for 6 years, and that's where I got my start as a piano player. I had just started to learn this music, and I thought, I was at a party and there was a piano there, and I said, for the first time ever in my life, I said, I'm going to be that guy, and I'm going to sit down at that piano and play. And I still needed to get sort of cajoled by my friends, but when I did it, it was like, the happiest moment for me. It was like this sort of realization that this is what I want to do. So there happened to be someone there who was building a piano bar. And so 6 months later, they called me up and gave me that job. So I was working in New York at that bar. That's kind of what gave me my break, I guess, and gave me like those 4-hour gigs. But I was really getting into the St. Louis style piano blues. So I was falling in love with it. Such a strong sound, this great accompaniment, low down piano sound. So I reached out to some people in St. Louis and discovered that there was really a lot going on here. There was a singer who goes by Miss Jubilee. Her name is Valerie Kirchhoff, that wanted to sing that old St. Louis blues. And there was so much piano history here. That was the other thing that surprised me. When I came down here to visit, I played piano, and they said, oh, that's not even Boogie Woogie. That's like earlier Barrel House. And like, nowhere else, or even in the country, knows what Boogie Woogie is. Like, when I was in Brooklyn, I was feeling like I was starting to really get a handle on the blues in a deep way, not a superficial way. And I finished a song that I thought like, well, that's deep blues, that is it. And someone would be like, oh, great stride, great ragtime. And it broke my heart, that people didn't have that ear for this kind of music, but here they'd grown up listening to it. They'd heard Roosevelt Sykes and Johnny Johnson, who was Chuck Berry's piano player. I mean, he lived till 2001 here. We had another guy, Henry Townsend, that he started recording in 1929 and lived till 2005, recording in 8 straight decades. So there was all this frame of reference here to the blues and the different styles, and the piano history was so deep that people just right away were into what I was doing and felt like there was a place for me here. So I visited here for a week, and 2 months later I moved here. I bought a one-way ticket, and I was here.
I want to move away from St. Louis for a moment and then come back, but the barrel houses, as you've told me, were developed on the work camps in the Deep South, which were male-dominated. I read somewhere the barrel house was designed to get you dancing, but these were bars without women, if I understand correctly.
Well, I'm sure the women made their way there. But and so I mean, it's a good question, and like it's I'm not entirely sure. I know some of the players who really like to play for the women didn't like to play at the barrel houses, and I think there's the connection there, for sure. But I think the women would find their way, especially women of ill repute, as they say.
And I would imagine, and apparently I'm wrong, that pianos would not have been readily available, and yet these barrel houses had pianos.
Sure. I mean, by the 1900s, by the 1910s and 20s, pianos were everywhere. They were cheap. They were getting churned out. There were so many piano makers in this country, and there was such a need for it and such a demand, that really they were everywhere, because you're at this sweet spot. The piano has this real sweet spot in American history, and the way I look at it is like after the Industrial Revolution, so you can make them, and before the jukebox. When all of a sudden you're electric, you don't need it anymore. So in that time in between, especially if you throw in Prohibition, when you have to be kind of underground or in different, people's apartments and things like that, the piano becomes king.
You had mentioned to me that a lot of these performers were in their mid-teens when they started to make a name for themselves on the road, and they were cross-pollinating as they met each other. They were taking trains everywhere. And and they were playing the piano. So somewhere around the house or in the neighborhood or in the community, they had a piano to practice on.
Yep, most people say their dad had one, their uncle had one. They go there and there. I mean, I wish I've had the chance to talk to more of these guys, and learn about what their process of learning, if they remember hearing a piano roll, or what so and so taught them, and how they actually learned. Be cool to see.
Now, so back to St. Louis. What drew this music to St. Louis? How did it develop there?
Well, St. Louis, is kind of always been this sort of perfect meeting point of the South and the North and the East and the West and so many different things. And so you have, W.C. Handy's first story of hearing the blues is not the slide guitar player in the, in the Delta. It's hearing the songs on the levee, while he tried to sleep on the cobblestones in St. Louis. And so all the way back then, when you had all the people working on the riverboats, and then all the trains went through East St. Louis. So it was always a major hub in that way. And then it was the cradle of ragtime. So by the 1890s, you had the first African-American, Tom Turpin, who ever published a rag, was from St. Louis. That's the Harlem Rag. Joplin moved there a few years later. And it was this musical hub where sort of this urban and rural styles started to really mix. And I think the blues owes a lot to St. Louis, and we've lost that a little bit in our story. That's become so Delta focused, and I'm not taking away from that, but we're losing a little too much of the story, I think.
Very interesting.
On Charlie Patton and Robert Johnson so much. Yeah.
Really interesting. Thank you for that. You mentioned some venues. Schlafly's, Evangeline's, where you play a Sunday brunch, and the Casa Loma Ballroom. Do any of those three go back?
Oh yeah, Casa Loma Ballroom. Cap Calloway played at Casa Loma Ballroom. Has a long history. I played a blues club called BB's Jazz, Blues, and Soups that has a great history in St. Louis. And Roosevelt Sykes helped christen the stage with Yank Rochelle and Henry Townsend. And so, and that was like a huge blues hub here, for and still is. I mean,
and so
we're in trouble, but
let's talk about Valerie Kirchhoff, Miss Jubilee of the Ya Boys.
Yes,
She recognized your fine talents, and you've hooked up. And
well, we were both. Valerie. Yeah, we were in a situation where the music we both loved independently of ourselves was female vocal music. And there's so much of that in St. Louis that came out of St. Louis, this low down plaintive style that is so beautiful and deep, but also not virtuosic for the singer or the piano player. So it's not music that if you're really out to become a good singer or a good musician or a good piano player, you're going to gloss over this stuff. So both of us independently fell in love with this music from me from the piano, her from the vocals. And when we discovered, and she's the first person I ever met who loved this music, ever. So, I mean, this music for me, I didn't get into, it's pretty clear from my concert that I did not get into this music to make friends. It was not a social thing for me. So this was like coming to St. Louis and meeting her was kind of the beginnings of music being a social thing at all for me. And finding someone I could talk to about this music at all. So she's a really great singer. She started of early blues and jazz. She did jump blues for a long time, and she's really beloved in this city. St. Louis, we don't have much of a national reputation. There's a lot of great music coming on in this town, traditional musics of all kinds, but we have an insular thing. Our fan base is locals. It's not a tourist kind of thing. So we just have our local fans, and she, more than anyone, has done a lot over the last dozen years to help build a following for young music, and brought out a lot of young players who are now making a living here playing music because of the work she did.
Well, I haven't yet heard her, but I look forward to seeking her out.
Yes. St. Louis Steady Grinders.
All right. Yeah, that's the duo that you have.
That's the duo that really focuses on that style of music. Yeah. And then our band, we have bass and trumpet and a clarinet and things like that. And we get a little more into the obscure swinging blues of the 30s, particularly.
Okay.
And so we'll really run the gamut from the early Bessie Smith and Victoria Spivey to Merlene Johnson of the 30s. That no one remembers Merlene Johnson, but she was awesome.
Now, so we're having this conversation because of COVID-19. What impact is that having on you? It's a real honor, by the way, for me to be able to talk to you. But what impact is this all having on you?
Well, the impact it's having on all musicians. You know, I'm an out of work musician. You know, all my venues have closed, and if they're starting to open back up, but I'm not quite ready to go back, I think. And all the festivals are gone, you know, and so it's been a huge change from, I mean, in St. Louis, I work a ton, you know, I have a lot of projects. I do the solo work, the band work. I have a bunch of different duo projects. I play in a band called the Bottle Snakes with a guitar player, and we do the piano guitar blues. But that all keeps you busy, and I'm a lucky problem to have, where I was working, you know, most nights of the week. And so that's all gone. So it's allowed a chance to kind of take a break and relax for a minute and figure out, you know, what I want to do moving forward and how I want to have my career and shape my career. Because I think about that constantly, really. It's been my obsession. It's just like how to build a sustainable career as a musician. And it's really scary to try to figure it out. And this sort of just destroyed the whole thing. So now it's sort of, you're kind of in a wait and see approach. I think that's where a lot of us are. You don't know.
Well, you strike me, you're a talented player, but you also have an interest in scholarship. I see you as an ethnomusicologist. I understand you've learned your skills on the street, but I would say this guy's an ethnomusicologist.
Well,
What goals do you have in that field?
Well, I think that's the route towards a sustainable career, and it's something I think about a lot. Is making it about education. Education is in my family. That's not music. My blood is education. My dad travels the world teaching math teachers and developing, you know, curriculum there. He's been fighting that uphill battle for a long time about improving math education. My brother is a teaching artist in Brooklyn and teaches at Brooklyn College, early development education for art. If I wasn't a player, I would be deeply involved in the music education, trying to shape that in either the school I was teaching at or in the country. So education means more to me. And I feel like we sometimes forget, and we think like the way to move this music forward is to play it for people and show them how cool it is and how great it is. But really it's to teach them about that and get them excited and wanting to hear it, and maybe giving them a beginner piece of music. And so the focus on education and seeing if I can, you know, lecture about this music. And it seems like the most fulfilling and sustainable path forward.
We're getting close to the end of our time, but you've kind of segued into my next question. What would be your message to young music students?
I think my main message to young music students is to just not be in such a rush to post your music online. Just take, you know, I see it all the time. I see these young kids, and it's cool, they're doing it, you know, they're on their bad sounding keyboard and they're working at it. But what happens is, as soon as you post any music, everyone is going to come out and tell you how great you are. It's what happens with music. You play it at any level, people tell you you're great. And if you start to believe that, or think that that's true, if it's not true, or even if it is true, it's the wrong path forward, because it doesn't keep you really invested in the process of what you need to be doing to get better. So I wish a few more musicians would wait for that moment that they've really put in their work and gotten to that place, and then started sharing it and having, when they have something to say, and not on a keyboard, please.
Beautiful. So you've got a record to your one album to your credit at the moment. It's got enough material. It's got one solo album, and it's got enough material on it for two. The Lowdown Piano Blues. Do I have that right?
That's the Lowdown Piano.
The Lowdown Piano.
Yep.
Where can folks find that?
You can get that through iTunes or stream it on Spotify. You can also listen to the Bottle Snakes record, which is called Candy Shop, and that's an album of all instrumental original tunes for piano guitar, or Miss Jubilee and the Yas Yas Boys, we just released Cool It If You Can, and that's available on Bandcamp. We'll make a physical copy when the time is right, but we recorded it right before this all went down. We went to Bristol, Tennessee, and recorded a record through tape, no digital, completely analog, live mixed, and it's got a warm, wonderful sound. And I was gonna make a solo record in March, but we see where that went. But I tried to do it last year. I wasn't quite happy with it, but I'm feeling ready again to get it done.
Well, as I said, this has been a great honor and a pleasure. I have to thank my partner, Ed Neri, the artistic director of Common Fence Music, for introducing me to you. I owe you more than a lunch, and we won't tell the audience why that is. But thank you. It's been a real pleasure, and I look forward to hearing your concert again on Sunday evening, June 7th. And of course, this will run afterwards. Thank you, Ethan. Ethan Leinwand. All right, salute. I know we'll be hearing more from you.
Hope so.
All right.